What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. One of Hearthstone's oldest and most iconic decks in the history of the game is Miracle Rogue, and although it's maybe not a top tier deck right now, it could definitely see some comeback in the future. And today we're going to be taking a look at Miracle Rogue and Rogue throughout its history, and finding out just how OP Miracle Rogue used to be. Bringing things all the way back to the alpha stage of Hearthstone, the Rogue class had access to one of the most overpowered cards in Hearthstone history, which was Adrenaline Rush. This card was a 1-mana spell with the effect to draw 1 card, but with a combo effect to draw 2 cards instead. And of course, may I remind you that this card only cost 1 freaking mana. Even without the actual combo effect, this spell honestly still would have been broken. You know, it synergizes with Gadgets and Auctioneer, allows Rogue to trigger combos without giving up card advantage, but being able to draw 2 cards for just 1 mana is pretty much the most powerful draw effect that has ever existed in Hearthstone, just flat out in terms of just raw power of the card, and it really enabled Rogue to play a ton of just super cheap costing cards for tempo to aggressively dominate the board without ever having to worry about running out of cards in their hand. And it allowed the deck to not only play an incredibly powerful game, but one that was also versatile and dynamic. And to top it off, this of course wasn't the only thing that Rogue had at the time. Rogue's old hero power was also incredibly broken, because if you had a dagger equipped already, it would just give the dagger a permanent +1 attack instead of re-equipping a new one, which meant that Rogue could just sit there and hero power every turn to eventually just build up a massive giant dagger to kill you in 1 or 2 hits. And this was especially scary when combined with cards like Blade Flurry or Envenom, which was another spell in the alpha stage that doubled your weapon's attack for the turn and allowed for some really quick OTKs, and you pretty much always had Envenom whenever you needed it because of Adrenaline Rush. You know, Envenom, Adrenaline Rush, and the Rogue hero power were changed or removed in alpha patches, but a lot of the other broken Rogue stuff still made it into the beta, so let's take a look. Moving on to the beta phase, Miracle Rogue, and just really Rogue in general, had access to a ton of crazy tools compared to today. So first off, while the hero power was no longer as overpowered, for a time in the beta the hero power was re-equip the 1/2 dagger or give your dagger +1 attack for this turn, which meant that you could still make your dagger a 2 power weapon from your hero power alone, which maybe might not seem like that big of a deal, but it really allowed Rogue to kill just loads of minions with the dagger effect that they just can't right now, and was great with things like Deadly Poison and Blade Flurry and all sorts of combo effects. As for some of the more notable overpowered cards, Edwin Van Cleef was definitely one of them, and it was kind of the same card it is today, except it had stealth, and it also had 1 fewer attack and health, but that didn't really matter that much because it had stealth. This meant that, you know, people could combo out just a crazy gigantic Edwin Van Cleef and really not have to worry about him dying to anything really. He had stealth, and Conceal as well cost 0 mana at the time, which meant that you could just go off with Gadgets and Auctioneers the turn you played it pretty much every single time, and you also get that free draw off of the Conceal effect. And speaking of mana reduction, Shiv was another card that also cost 1 less mana. However, Preparation did only reduce the cost of spells by 2 mana at the time, which was later on changed in a beta patch, but there wasn't really that many Rogue spells at all that you would ever prep for 3 mana at the time anyway, since everything was so cheap in the first place. And at the same time, the Rogue class had such an incredible amount of early game power cards. You know, Backstab could deal 2 damage even to damaged enemy minions, and Defias Ringleader was a 2/3 creature, making it very difficult to kill, and as well guaranteeing you early board presence in pretty much just every game that you drew it. The deck could go off so much faster, play so much better, had a better hero power, and everything just cost less mana. Not to mention that your Edwin Van Cleef pretty much just won the game straight up every time you drew it, if you had a couple spells to back it up. And unfortunately for Miracle Rogue players, most of these cards were reverted back to the versions that you know today in a beta patch, which changed a large amount of cards for a variety of classes. But despite that, the deck really didn't die out at all. It actually kind of continued to excel, and especially from open beta until the Curse of Naxxramas days, when it became a popular choice for tournament players and a ladder deck that a lot of people constantly complained about. So back in the day with the Rogue class, there were just a ton of cards that were way more overpowered, as well as the hero power having a lot more options as well. But there were quite a few things that really just came together to make the deck such a historic, such an iconic deck in the history of Hearthstone in terms of just how overpowered it actually was. And part of this was maybe the efficiency, tempo cards like Sap and Backstab that really naturally provided a lot of tempo to Rogue decks, and similarly things like Backstab and SI Agent allowed Rogue to just gain board control back so easily or just secure it in the first place, and cards like Blade Flurry and Fan of Knives made aggro players just dread the Miracle Rogue matchup. Before it was nerfed in 2016, Blade Flurry of course only cost 2 mana and also hit the player as well, and so it was a great tool for both the board control and the combo aspects of pretty much every Rogue deck that's existed throughout time. And the biggest reason that Miracle Rogue stayed at the top for so long though was actually the insane finishing power of Leroy Jenkins. There's a reason why Blizzard nerfed charge finishers like Arcane Golem, Force of Nature, and of course eventually they did nerf Leroy because he was no exception. Charge is honestly just an incredibly powerful mechanic, and while it might be somewhat balanced in some really early game aggressive decks, it gets totally abused in combo decks, and having a 4 mana Leroy as well as access to Sap meant that your opponent was pretty much never safe. Even if you had no board, they had a taunt and were at a high life total. The typical combo of the later days of Miracle Rogue, which was of course insanely easy to draw into in the first place with a 5 mana Gadgets and Auctioneer, involved using Leroy and 2 Shadow Steps as well as potentially some Cold Bloods, and for 8 mana, 9 or 10 if you had a Cold Blood in there, you got an 18 or more damage burst, and you could spend the leftover mana maybe using Sap. If you had a Preparation in there, you could use some Eviscerates and just do tons of stuff. Double Cold Bloods as well, dealing up to 26, sometimes even 30 damage from just no board straight up if you maybe had a Preparation or two. And really, you know, that's pretty much the definition of fun and interactive gameplay right there. Gadget Sand was also incredibly hard to remove back then, since cards like Flame Cannon, a lot of area of effect abilities weren't really played all that much at the time, and pretty much the only removal you could hope for was maybe a Flame Strike, which wasn't really that common, Brawl, or a Shadow Flame. And although Tinkmaster Overspark was maybe a fairly common card to play at the time, it was a targeted ability as well, and as a result wasn't usable on stealth. A majority of the decks at the time pretty much just had no way to deal with the concealed Gadgets and Auctioneer, which meant that the Rogue player was just going to draw into the combo every single time pretty much, because you would end up getting 5, 6, sometimes as much as 10 draws the following turn at the very least. And even without Conceal, a cheaper Gadgets and Auctioneer was really just way too much of a card draw engine, and it made Rogue in general just way too consistent. Miracle Rogue has honestly been such a powerful deck throughout history, and at the time especially, people who were good with it would just crush everything else. So it was inevitable that of course a lot of the cards got nerfed, Gadgets and Auctioneer, Leroy, and it eventually fell out of favor, and later on new Rogue archetypes started to emerge as the dominant powerhouse for the class. Since the big nerfs, Miracle Rogues have tried a couple new strategies, the most successful of which has been most notably Oil Rogue, using weapon buffs to finish off the opponent with a super large attack and Blade Flurry, and just doing a bunch of damage with that combo. However, since Tinker's Sharp Sword Oil was of course removed from Standard, and Blade Flurry has just been nerfed into the ground, today's Miracle Rogue only really relies on strong tempo plays like Backstab and SI Agent, as well as Gadgets and Auctioneer and Preparation to keep up in cards. And although it's maybe a viable deck, it's definitely not tier 1, and it's nowhere near the power levels it once had. However, it's really the type of deck that could definitely get another resurgence in the future. All it really takes is just one card, maybe 2, to put together a nice combo piece, and again, you can have a top tier deck. Anyway, that's going to be it for me today. Thank you for joining me and taking a look back at how OP Miracle Rogue used to be. What do you think was the most broken aspect of Rogue throughout history? Definitely let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.